I like to take the opportunity during the holidays, when possible, to step back from the news cycle and explore a few topics in greater depth. Topics that I believe can help us better understand the times in which we're living and how we should respond from a biblical perspective. Now, I think most of you would probably agree with this statement that the world is upside down. Right is wrong, wrong is right. To espouse today what used to be the consensus in our culture will get you canceled and possibly hauled into court. There's a new morality in America that not only demands tolerance, but seeks to use the levers of government to force, not just accept, but to celebrate. Now, at the heart of this is sexual identity. Sex has gone from an act of procreation to the core of human identity in our culture today. Signature lines, which were once punctuated with abbreviations of academic credentials, are now being eclipsed with the listing of preferred pronouns. And speaking of academia, what role have they played in all of this? Well, guess what? We're going to explore this today. What are the historical roots of this identity politics that has taken the country by storm? How did we get here? And what, if anything, can and should the church, that's Bible-believing Christians, do? Well, as I said, we're going to talk about this and more on today's edition of Washington Watch. Dr. Carl Trueman, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, will join me for this discussion in just a moment. The website, tonyperkins.com, lots of resources there for you. I encourage you to check it out, visit it, put it on your browser, and visit it often. Also, the Washington Stand. This is where you can get news and commentary from a biblical perspective, so be sure and check that out if you've not already done so. And it is the end of the year, and this is when the Family Research Council receives the bulk of our financial support. Unlike NPR, we receive no government money. We do not have advertisers. What we have are folks like you all across this country that understand the value of news and information from a Bible-centered organization in our nation's capital. So thanks to a special year-end challenge match by Friends of FRC, your gift will have double the impact if we receive it before December 31st. So to partner with us to ensure that Washington Watch continues, we've got folks standing by to take your call, 800-225-4008. That's 800-225-4008, or you can visit tonyperkins.com and partner with us online. Well, earlier this year, Dr. Carl Trueman released the book, Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Now, it was a follow-up to the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and we had him on the show for a segment to talk briefly about the book, but I wanted to spend a little more time unpacking this and talking about the foundation of what we see today in terms of identity politics. How did we get here? And how should we as Christians navigate the cultural shift that we're witnessing? Well, join me now for this conversation is church historian, author, and professor of biblical and religious studies, Dr. Carl Trueman. Professor Trueman, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Now, I want to start with the previous book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is really kind of the foundational work for what you have done. Give our listeners and our viewers, if you will, just kind of the book's thesis. What is the main point that you are communicating?
Interesting question. The book really arose out of my desire to make explicable to myself and to others why a certain statement has come to be intuitively commonsensical to most people in our culture. And that sentence is, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. I'm intrigued by the idea that something so strange, so counterintuitive, should now be so generally accepted, not merely generally accepted, but increasingly enforced as political and social orthodoxy. So the book was an attempt to answer why has that statement become plausible, and to boil its argument down into 30 seconds of sound bites. I would say my argument was one: over the last 400 or 500 years, the self, our understanding of who we are, what makes us us, has become increasingly psychologized. We've increasingly focused upon inner feelings as defining who we are. Secondly, those inner feelings, certainly in the last 100 years or so, have become profoundly sexualized. We've increasingly come to, I won't say reduce our inner feelings to sexual desires, but to make our sexual desires the most fundamental aspect of those inner feelings, such that I am my sexual desires. And thirdly, there's been a politicization of this. Once you make sex, once you make sexual desire, once you make inner feelings the core of who you really are, then legislation that restricts those feelings, legislation that restricts the legitimacy of expressing those inner feelings outwardly, becomes personally oppressive and becomes a matter of political contestation and a matter of political urgency. So it's the psychologization of the self, the sexualization of psychology, and the politicization of sex. Those are the three things that have gone on.
So I want to start with that last one because it's kind of in the world where we dwell and where our viewers are accustomed to us talking about, and that's the legislation, the policy. Historically, our nation has had a foundation for its policy. It's deviated, obviously, but natural law, transcendent truth, and that comes from our Judeo-Christian foundation. So if our laws are coming from those sources also become a target of this new morality.
Yes, there's a sense in which what we're seeing unraveling is the old, you might say, liberal consensus based upon external realities and upon basic conventions of how to handle those realities. I quoted more times than I care to remember Thomas Jefferson's comment about debates about existence and belief in God, where he makes the comment, it doesn't really matter to me whether my neighbor believes in one God, 20 gods, or no gods at all. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. He lives in a world where there may be disagreements over the divine, the existence of God, for example, but the basic rights of property and of bodily safety are ingrained into the very nature of the world in which we exist. We're seeing that overturned at the moment, and of course that requires an overturning of the framework within which those rights were originally thought to be. I would also say that what we're seeing with the exaltation of the individual self is the last stage, or the latest stage. One always hesitates to say the last stage these days. The latest stage of a rebellion against any notion of external authority imposing upon me limits, restrictions to my behavior or my identity.
Well, you've set the table for a discussion of so much. I want to go to that last point because I think that is really at the heart of this from a spiritual perspective, is a resistance or a rebellion to any external authority. And when we're talking about morality, we've got to be talking about God.
Yes. I mean, I was asked a question on a podcast run by a couple of atheists about 6 months ago. Is it possible to build a moral society without believing in God? And my answer was, I'm not going to say no way, never, because I cannot conceptualize every type of society that could exist. But the default position is that there has to be some kind of sacred order in order for our social order to have any form of stability or longevity to it. When a society justifies itself purely on the basis of itself, it becomes inherently unstable. What the West has been doing for many centuries, I think, we're now seeing the results of this, is assuming the outward results of belief in God, stable morality, for example, while actually rejecting any commitment to the existence of God. And that lasted for a while, but now it's beginning to fall apart. We're beginning to realize that what we've done is built a castle on air, effectively.
Yeah, we're seeing this. The headlines, people are experiencing it on the rise of violence in our street, the social disorder, the pathologies that are coming from the breakup of the family, that core foundational stone of Western civilization. But this is not new. The philosophies that are driving this didn't just appear yesterday. They have their roots in history. And you talk about that in your book.
Oh yes, I mean, and no event or phenomenon in history is its own cause. There's always a background. In the book, I go back to Rousseau, the 18th century Genevan philosopher. But of course, Rousseau doesn't emerge out of nowhere. One could have looked at the influences on Rousseau, but I think particularly in the 18th century, we see that the forces that are now shaping society beginning to gain in confidence and beginning to accelerate and beginning to work out more consistently some of the impulses that are now dismantling traditional society as we see it. So I start with Rousseau. I think Rousseau's emphasis upon the inner space, upon the pristine nature of human beings in nature, that it's society that messes us up. I think these things are foundational to the way the modern world thinks. It leads to a prioritization of youth, for example. The younger you are, the less corrupted and the less spoiled you are. It leads to child-centered educational theory. Rousseau is a pioneer, really, in the child-centered educational theory department. What we see with Rousseau in the 18th century is the articulation of numerous principles that have since become internalized in our society. They're now the way we all intuitively think about these things.
Now, of course, Rousseau's thinking and his philosophy very strong in driving the French Revolution. And in fact, last year I think I took time out to talk with Oz Guinness, where he juxtaposed the American Revolution, the War for Independence, with the French Revolution and the ideals behind that. What Rousseau, and of course what he was saying is Rousseau's philosophy and ideology is incompatible with the type of republic that we have, the morality-based foundation that we have for our country today, or should have for our today.
Yes, I think the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is that ultimately the American Revolution has these sort of checks and balances philosophically built into it that respect the rights of individuals to be different and respects the need to protect the weak and the innocent. Things, of course, that are derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Whereas the French Revolution, with its emphasis upon the will of the people, ultimately sort of has this rather, nihilistic approach. And of course, the difference between, there was bloodshed in the American Revolution, of course, but the quantity of blood shed in the two revolutions, there's no real comparison at all.
Okay, we were talking before the break about Rousseau, but there are other academics, thinkers, political philosophers that are really at the heart of what we see unfolding in this identity politics that's taken the nation by storm. And some think, well, where did this come from? This has actually been brewing for a long time.
Yes, and I think central to identity politics, of course, is the loss of that which binds us together, such that it's overwhelmed by the particularities of our circumstance. And a key part of that is what happens in the 19th century. In the book, I draw on three particular thinkers, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Charles Darwin, though there would have been others who fitted the bill. I chose those three because they're particularly influential, I think. What do the three of them have in common? What they have in common is this. They essentially reject the idea of a stable notion of human nature as having some kind of moral or ethical structure, constant moral or ethical structure. They turn human beings essentially into products of history, and they mitigate or eliminate the difference in human beings and other animals. And what does that do? Well, that really, we might say, frees us up in some way to be whatever we want to be. And that lays the intellectual groundwork for much of what we see today, where particularities of social circumstance, race, for example, become more important at providing unity than the underlying unity of human nature. The Bible, of course, talks about us all being made in the image of God, and that provides something that binds me together with people from Mexico, people from sub-Saharan Africa, people from the easternmost parts of Russia. We're all human beings. once the humanity ceases to be significant, the field is really open, therefore, for human beings to construct their own bespoke identities and to engage in conflict relative to those constructed identities. And I think the way for that is really paved by, as I say, Marx, Darwin, and Nietzsche in their different ways in the 19th century.
Yeah, you're right. In The Rise and Triumph of Modern Self, self-creation is a routine part of our modern social imaginary. Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it lies very much at the heart of the modern American project. What I mean is that first of all, the social imaginary refers to the intuitive framework within which we all operate. When you think about how we think about and relate to the world, very little of our thinking about the world and our relating to the world is done on the basis of arguing from first principles. Most of us imagine the world to be a certain kind of place. We imagine ourselves to be a certain kind of people, and we live on the basis of those imaginative constructions and of those intuitions that we have. We intuitively, I think, in the West, particularly in America, we intuitively think that we're masters of our own destiny. We intuitively think that we can be whatever we want to be. Well, that's self-creation. Self-creation is the idea that I'm not given an identity. It's not something that comes from without, that I have to live in accordance with. It's something I can think up for myself. Most extreme example would be the transgenderism, which I referred to right at the start. When you think about it, what is a transgender person claiming? They're claiming that not even their body has the authority to tell them who they are, but it's their feelings. It's that which lives within their body. It's their own desires. It's their own instincts, intuitions. That's the really authoritative thing. And that really is the basis of self-creation.
So, Dr. Trueman, let me ask you a question. How does society survive in that paradigm? I mean, I'm thinking, it's the time of year people like watching sports. We got football games and things like that. I mean, what if we just went on the field and we imagined what the rules were, and it just wouldn't work. So how does society work that way?
Well, ultimately, society cannot work that way. It cannot be a free for all. Somebody has to, as you use the sporting analogy, somebody has to referee this match. And what that means is that over time, certain identities will be deemed legitimate and some will be deemed illegitimate. And there will be groups, whether it's government or whether it's big corporations, that essentially decide who's legitimate and who isn't. So what we'll see, I think, and what we're seeing already, but what we will see in more dramatic ways in the next decade or so, is the emergence of what my friend Rod Dreher calls soft totalitarianism, where certain social norms are imposed.
You have to, because they're so outside common sense. The only way is to use the levers of government to force you to accept it. And that's what we see unfolding right now.
Yes, when you think about the enforcing of pronouns, et cetera, within our society, this stuff has to be, it's odd in that a radically libertarian understanding of what it means to be a human being will ultimately degenerate into a kind of soft totalitarian form of society. It's very, very counterintuitive to think of it that way, but it's obviously what's happening.
Well, and I want to talk about that when we come back, about how we're getting there and the way that is resisted by speaking truth. But before we get to that point, when we come back from the break, I want to talk about, this is not just activists that are espousing these thoughts. I've been talking about The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I think is your foundational work, but the other book that is more recent that's out is A Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Talk about that book for just a moment in contrast with or comparison with The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
There's a huge overlap between the two books. The shorter book actually finds its origin and the suggestion from Ryan Anderson, the head of the EPPC, who read the larger book and said to me, I really enjoyed it, but there's a problem. It's too long. I need something that I can give to DC staffers that they'll read on their morning commute. And a number of pastors had contacted me as well and said, could you boil this stuff down so we can use it in a Sunday school?
Yeah.
So the book originates really as that project. And one of your employees, actually, Joy Zavalik, now Joy Stockbauer, was one of my research assistants working on it. So there's a family research council connection there. And this book, it really distills the arguments of the larger book into a more manageable and readable form. It does a few other things as well. I have a section on a little bit more reflection on the role of technology in the transformation of the self. So there are a few other things that I play around with in the book, but essentially it's a distillation of the basic thesis of the larger book.
And what's the best way for people to get a copy of the book?
I'm still sold on Amazon, unlike my friend Ryan.
I was wondering about that.
No, I'm still available on Amazon, and of course via Crossway as well. So you can get hold of the book at the moment through either of those outlets.
Well, folks, I highly recommend the book. I enjoyed it, and I agree. I've actually had people tell me, is there a shorter version of it, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self? But it was so enlightening to me. I mean, these are things that I knew, but you connected the dots. So folks, I would highly recommend getting a copy of The Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution, or The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Now, in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and I just happened to be reading it this past summer when the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision came out. I just happened, it was almost on the same day, I was reading through this, and you comment on the Supreme Court case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And I had not seen this before, but you quote from that decision by the Supreme Court, written by Justice Kennedy, the majority opinion written by him, and you said, at the heart of liberty, this is what he wrote, at the heart of liberty to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state. I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about, the creating one's own existence.
Yes, it's a remarkable statement. I mean, Kennedy really codifies there a large part of what I try to argue in the book. And of course, it's complete nonsense. The state has an absolute interest in defining, or at least in pointing out and codifying what it is that constitutes life and personhood. You could scarcely have a law code of any variety that doesn't do those things. But I use the word loosely, it's a beautifully concise statement of what I consider to be the problem. And the fact that this was articulated by a Reagan appointee to the Supreme Court is fascinating, really. And it shows how expressive individualism, which is the form of selfhood I've been talking about here, is not a monopoly of the left or of the right. It's a more omnipresent cultural phenomenon that sits very easily with some very conservative sort of libertarian views and some very radical progressive views. So Kennedy's statement there shows that this doesn't carve up typically along normal party political lines.
It permeates the academic world. I mean, that we see this throughout the literature. We see this coming out of academia. I mean, I think it's been brewing there for years, and now it is just like boiled over, and we're seeing it throughout society.
Yes, I mean, you can see transgenderism would be a great example. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, what is the least plausible strand of modern post-structural theory or critical theory of which you're aware, I would have said gender theory. Mm-hmm. Of all of the critical theories, that is the most nonsensical, because there is clearly a biological grounding to the distinction between male and female. And yet that's the strand of critical theory that has become most powerful and most potent within our culture at this particular point in time. So I think that shows you one should never underestimate the power of intellectual activists to press their case. Two, one should never underestimate the gullibility of politicians and perhaps the wider public in
Right.
buying into things that are nonsensical
Well,
if they happen to suit a particular purpose.
the scripture describes us as sheep. And we see people being led down this path of deception. But I have to ask the question, where are the shepherds? All right, three things I want to get to, at least in this last segment. And I want to go back to that Dobbs decision for just a moment. That I think, and that was, again, the timing of me reading your book and then experiencing the Dobbs decision. The present Supreme Court kind of pulled back the veil on this creative thinking of the court and exposed it for what it was. It had no anchor in the Constitution and, frankly, was untethered to reality.
Yes, yes, I think that's the case. I mean, one of the things that Anthony Kennedy's sort of fantasy statement in Planned Parenthood v. Casey indicated was a notion of being human, where we are all completely autonomous. And if we have the right to self-creation, as he seems to be stating there, then inevitably everybody else becomes first and foremost a potential threat to us. Autonomy is sort of established at law, and all relationships in which we engage with others become purely contractual and based solely on whether they can enhance our personal happiness or not. Hence, if a woman is carrying a baby that she doesn't want, the baby's a threat to her, and she should be able to get rid of it if it's going to inhibit her happiness. Well, we all know that that just isn't true. We are always existing in relationships of dependency and obligation towards other people. And I think what the court is beginning to do at this point is to recognize that actually the significance, we might say, of Roe v. Wade and of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, yes, it was significant for abortion, but they were also deeply significant as trying to codify into law an anthropological revolution.
Right.
That simply isn't true and isn't workable. And thankfully, the court have rolled that back somewhat. How successful it will be in the long run remains to be seen.
Right.
But there is at least some acknowledgement there. And I think what we see, of course, is that the justices who did that are all people of Christian conviction. And that is not incidental, I think, to their understanding of what it means to be a human being.
I do think there's a spiritual element here of rolling back Roe v. Wade and ending abortion on demand, for at least the allowing that in states, because it doesn't go back to the states. I think there's a spiritual element of the pushback that we're seeing, the intensity of the battle that is flared up. But also, I think it's, as I said, I think it's because they expose the fallacy that you can put whatever you want to into the Constitution. And I think that's what we saw, this really strong push to codify the Obergefell decision into federal law, because they realized it was built on the same faulty foundation.
Yes, it becomes a kind of assertion of brute strength at that point. I think, and I think there's an interesting wider phenomenon here, that the biggest issues in our society have tended to default to the judicial branch over the last 30, 40, 50 years, rather than to the legislative branch. And that helps create the polarized political environment we're now in. It's one thing to lose at the polls. It's another thing to have one swing vote on the Supreme Court change everything. So I think there are all kinds of issues emerging at this point that are fascinating and somewhat disturbing.
Well, I think the reason we're seeing the court increasingly take on these issues in the last half century is a lack of political courage and will. They want to sidestep the tough issues, and they'd rather have the court deal with them so they don't have to, because it affects their political future. I want to go now to this issue as we see, we were making reference to earlier about how people are being led down this path. They know it's not true, but yet they're afraid to say something in this cancel culture. They're afraid of the conflict. They're afraid of the ostracization that takes place. What should be the response of, number one, Christians, just the average Christian out there, Bible-believing Christian who follows Christ, and then B, their shepherds, their leaders? What should be the voice of pastors? What should they be doing at this moment?
Yeah, well, I would actually answer the question the other way around. I would say, first of all, Christian leadership needs to get its act in order. We need strong leadership at this point. We need ministers who are preaching the whole counsel of God, and therefore providing their people with good, clear frameworks for parsing the various issues that will cross their path, typically at the workplace. I think that's where a lot of Christians are going to feel most pressure in the coming 5 or 10 years. Do I use preferred pronouns? Not every hill is a hill that you have to die on. So Christians need good guidance from the pulpit about what the whole counsel of God requires of them, and hopefully to instill not only right thinking, but also discernment to know, yes, this is a battle I have to fight. No, this is a sideshow. This is not a battle I have to fight. So we need strong leadership. We need well-trained ministers in ethics, I think, particularly in Protestantism, because the basic moral imagination of the United States has been sort of broadly Protestant for several centuries. The Protestant church has got lazy in thinking about ethics. Suddenly, as that moral imagination is disappearing, we find that we're left high and dry. We don't have that strong tradition of moral thinking that Roman Catholicism has, for example, upon which to draw to address whatever craziness the culture throws up next. So I think we need to be educating people in how to think morally and ethically. I think we need our churches to be strong communities, because there's, if you're going to stand, if you're going to stand when pressure comes, it's always easier to stand shoulder to shoulder with others than to stand on your own. And that requires a culture of the church as a community where we support each other, where we have each other's backs. I was fascinated at how the LGBTQ movement had become so powerful in a comparatively short period of time. And part of the answer to that is they were actually a community. They coordinated, they had each other's backs, they were deeply involved in each other's lives. Now, I'm not flying a flag here for the LGBTQ community, but I'm saying I think there's something we can learn from there, that strength comes from community.
Yes, well, that's biblical. I mean,
Absolutely.
and we saw really during COVID, when churches were not meeting, we saw the flare up of civil unrest in our society, and I think there's a connection between the two. I think there's a spiritual connection there. But to your point on the LGBTQ community, you actually write about this in both works. About how there are fracture lines within this community. They're not walking lockstep. In fact, some of their purposes, some of their goals are at cross purpose with one another, with the various elements of the LGBTQ. So there is the very real possibility that there could be internal chaos and confusion within that movement.
Yes, I mean, ironically, I'm going to be interviewed by Andrew Sullivan in the next couple of days for his podcast, who, of course, is a famous gay Catholic journalist. And one of the interesting things about Andrew Sullivan is he's been anathematized by sections of the LGBTQ community for his opposition to transgenderism. And he's emblematic of what's going on. You have the L, the G, and the B assume the importance of the physical, biological sex binary. The T and the Q deny that. What we've seen thus far, I think, is an alliance built on the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. To use their terminology, white, heterosexual, heteronormativity is the enemy. As that has got weaker, so now we're beginning to see the LGBTQ alliance starting to fracture and crumble. And we're seeing people like J.K. Rowling, who would be very favorable towards the LGB, standing pretty strongly against the trans issue at this point. So that reflects, I think, internal incoherences and contradictions within the movement itself.
All right, Dr. Trueman, we're almost out of time. This is a new reality. This is where we live. We see this. We see it in our schools. We see our children being taught that this is normal. As believers, number one, we've been warned. Jesus warned us that there was going to be difficult and challenging times. Now, it actually kind of did spell it out a little bit in Romans chapter 1. Paul kind of talks about where the end leads, or where this path leads to, and I think we're pretty much close to the end of chapter 1 if you follow the progression. But Jesus over in John, when he was talking with his disciples about, you're going to be hated, you're going to be rejected, you're going to get everything that I got. But you know what? I'm telling you this so that you don't stumble, and I'm telling you this so that you can preserve your joy. I mean, we're not to be, I don't think, feel like we're embattled or that we have to hunker down. I actually think this is a great moment for Bible-believing Christians, those that are firmly standing on the truth of God's Word, because it's just a matter of time until they realize, those on the left and those that have been sucked into this, realize, you know what? This doesn't answer the big questions of life.
Absolutely. I've said numerous occasions over the last couple of years that what we're facing now is certainly a cause for lamentation. I don't think the changes I'm seeing in society at the moment give me cause for joy and rejoicing on one level. On the other hand, I think if we simply see what's happening around us as a cause for lamentation, we're going to end up despairing. We mustn't forget the promises. The promises are to the church. We know how it all ends. So let us lament, but let us also think about how this particular moment in time presents us with peculiar opportunities that can be used for capitalizing on by the church. And one of them I've already alluded to. I think in a world where true community is collapsing, this may be an opportunity for the church as a strong community to prove rather attractive to those who may not have listened to her message 10, 15, 20 years ago. So don't despair, keep hold of the promises, understand, we're heading into difficult times. There is plenty of cause for lamentation, but let us combine that lamentation with hopeful action and reflection upon how we might use the opportunities, the unique opportunities we're being given at this moment in time in order to advance the kingdom.
Yeah, I want Christians to understand, no matter how difficult it becomes, this is not the time to disengage. It's not the time to pack up and go home. It's not time, to bury our heads in the sand because it's so bad. I think when it gets the darkest, when people begin to look for answers, if we have our wits about us, and as you said, we're building that community, others will want to join. I still believe a turning is possible, that we could see our society and our nation turn back.
Absolutely. The thing about societies in history is, sometimes they commit suicide, sometimes they pull back from the brink. You cannot tell what a society is going to do until it does one thing or the other. And I'm certainly not willing at this point to give up on our society and say it's all over. Apart from anything else, I still think that in the West in general, and in America in particular, the church is in a stronger and better position in terms of its civil rights and its public presence than in many other parts of the world. So we also have a lot to give thanks for. We are not being persecuted here as the church is being persecuted in many parts of the world, not least China. So, lament what's going on, but remain hopeful and also give thanks for the many blessings that we still have in this country that are denied to brothers and sisters in other countries.
Well, Dr. Trueman, that's a good biblical note to stop on, because in Philippians we're told to be anxious for nothing, but by prayer with thanksgiving let our requests be made known unto God. And that's what I would leave our folks with, is to be thankful that we still have those freedoms that we can use to preserve our freedoms and gain them for others. Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for joining us today. Great conversation, and quite frankly, we just scratched the surface. I again appreciate the work that you've done. Eye-opening, fascinating, and I'm going to encourage people to pick up a copy of both books.
Thanks for your kind words, Tony. Love to spend time with you.